Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. A review by Louis Hillenbrand. Siddhartha is a coming-of-age novel published in 1922 by Hermann Hesse, a German writer who was born in 1877 and died in 1962. Hesse's works are celebrated the world over for their rich contribution to the typically German literary genre of Bildungsroman, a tradition of coming-of-age novels that is considered by most scholars to have started with Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's novel Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship from 1796. The way the German Bildungsromane differentiate themselves from international coming-of-age novels is with their particular attention paid to the spiritual development of their main characters, usually reflecting their author's interest in the subject. Such was the case for Hermann Hesse. Indeed, an exploration of personal spirituality is the main theme across the majority of Hesse's works. Hesse's maternal grandparents were Christian missionaries of the Swiss Basel Mission who were sent to India, translating the Bible into local languages. His father also worked for a publishing company specializing in theological works. Hesse grew up in a pietist household in the town of Krale and underwent the required schooling of his days, spending some time at the Maulbronn monastery that proved very difficult for him. His parents were quick to notice a rebellious spirit within him. When he came of age, instead of going to university like many of his contemporaries, he worked in bookstores and antique stores, studying the works of great authors and philosophers such as Goethe and Nietzsche. This in turn allowed him to develop himself spiritually. During the 1890s, he published a number of poems with neglectful success. It was only with the publication of his first novel, Peter Kamensin, in 1904, that Hesse could get married and finally afford to live off his writing. The story of a young man's wanderings in the world in search of himself would come to be the trademark of Hesse's genius. The success of the novel allowed him, after a few other minor works and the deterioration of his marriage, to go on a long voyage through Sri Lanka and Indonesia in 1911. During World War I, although he was eager to enlist in the Imperial German Army and act instead of remaining idle, he was considered inept to serve and was instead tasked to care for prisoners of war. During that time, he wrote a famous essay called O Freunde, nicht diese Töne, speaking out in the name of peace and brotherhood among nations. Unfortunately, this appeal for peace was met with hatred from the German press of the time. Not only that, but the death of his father in 1916, his son Martin's severe illness, and his wife's schizophrenia forced Hesse to undergo psychotherapy. It was at that time that he became acquainted with psychoanalysis and the work of Carl Jung, which inspired him for his 1919 novel Demian. Soon after, his marriage fell apart and he relocated to Montagnola in Switzerland, where he began a productive part of his career. It was during that time, in 1922, that he wrote one of his most famous novels that still enchants readers and spiritual seekers to this day, Siddhartha. This novel bears witness to Hesse's lifelong interest in spirituality, but also his family background in India and his interest in Buddhism that he developed in the early 1910s. Although the title might suggest a dramatization of the story of the Buddha Siddhartha Gautama, it follows a fictional protagonist of the same name living a similar awakening process, even though the Buddha himself makes an appearance. It is the story of Siddhartha, the son of a Brahmin in India, who, in spite of excelling at studying the various Hindu scriptures and teachings, nevertheless yearns for a deeper understanding of life and its meaning. After escaping his father's palace, he joins a group of Hindu ascetics and lives a life of homelessness and poverty for 3 years. That is when rumors begin to spread about an enlightened spiritual teacher performing miracles and teaching about the way to reach bliss. Siddhartha eventually attends a gathering around the person of the Buddha, who shares his teachings with the masses. Even though the words of the enlightened one make a great impression on the audience and on Siddhartha's friend Govinda, Siddhartha is rather awakened to the necessity of following his own personal spiritual path, instead of following either the ascetic community of which he was part or the new religion founded by the Buddha. This personal spiritual quest leads Siddhartha to Kamala, the courtesan of a local merchant who becomes Siddhartha's lover and sensual mentor. The merchant lord eventually accepts Siddhartha and teaches him about his trade. Thus begins a prosperous part of Siddhartha's life as a merchant. Though he initially acts out his duties in a carefree manner that seems to make him very happy, his attitude irritates his master and he reproaches him. In time, however, Siddhartha becomes more and more addicted to his new life and enters a cycle of vice and gambling. This new life bears so heavy on him that he decides to leave all these riches behind and eventually finds himself assisting a ferryman living by a river that, in its natural sound that carries the totality of existence, enlightens him fully about the meaning of his life. In spite of meeting with his former lover before her death, as well as trying to keep the son he had with her close to him without success, Siddhartha learns to listen to the river and embrace the song of the earth in both its cries of joy and suffering. Instead of forcing himself to find a spiritual path to remove suffering from his life, the novel ends with Siddhartha disclosing these holistic teachings to his friend Govinda who, in spite of having become a Buddhist monk, finds himself enlightened by this son of a Brahmin turned ferryman's teachings about embracing the totality of the universe. Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha is a classic coming-of-age novel whose wisdom still influences many spiritual seekers to this day. For instance, we see many famous personalities on YouTube focusing on spirituality still listing this novel among their favorite books. In spite of these personalities thriving mostly on disclosing practices to alleviate the anxiety and woes so common to today's world, we see that the holistic wisdom carried in Hesse's novel is still most compelling. For many of us, including myself in the past, spirituality is seen as but a tool acting as medicine on wounds begotten by modern society's obsession with fast productivity. And while it is obviously very true that neoliberal capitalism has pushed our Western society towards senseless individualism and hedonism, disconnecting us from our roots as individuals and peoples, to treat spirituality in itself as only a cure to find happiness in the midst of these modern woes limits the spiritual dimension of life, in my opinion. It is easy to interpret Siddhartha's story like many online spiritual personalities do, as yet another invitation to dissolve one's ego so as to lower one's desires and expectations in life, and therefore free oneself from suffering, and accept all that life has in store passively. However, this would not be true to Siddhartha's path in the novel, but to the Buddha's path. The way I see it, Siddhartha's quest is not to evade suffering and melt into the teachings of a so-called enlightened teacher in a nihilistic fashion, but rather a creation of one's own path. He embraces his own personal calling fully, comes to the conclusion that the teachings of his father's Brahmin caste or the Buddha are not enough for the cravings of his soul, and decides to go on his own personal journey. Like Hesse's previous novel Demian, Siddhartha's quest is one of self-knowledge above all. Hermann Hesse was very interested in the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, especially his recognition of both order and passion as leading forces of the human spirit. This duality is at the heart of Hesse's novels, and in Siddhartha, we find a resolution in the accepting of one's inner calling to find one's own spiritual essence, and also to embrace both the joys and sorrows of life in a stoic manner, as being part of that great adventure of self-realization. It is not a call to erase oneself and submit to the ways of the world, but rather to always journey forth, understand the ways of the world, and surpass their effects in living one's fulfilled life and spirituality in the grand scheme of things. In conclusion, Hermann Hesse's novel Siddhartha is a landmark not only in the German tradition of Bildungsroman, but also in the spiritual development of the Western world, especially since the 1960s. His words continue to find eager readers to this very day, and are bound to never cease to do so thanks to their universally human character, and the way they talk about human nature and experiences in such touching depth and delicacy. Every novel I read by him amazes me more and teaches me more than the previous one, so much so as for him to be one of my favorite and most impactful novelists of all time, one most deserving of the Nobel Prize in Literature that he won in 1946. His work is an invitation to the joy of self-discovery that reflects the noble character of this ever-journeying and benevolent soul that was Hermann Hesse. Thank you for watching. If you liked what you saw, please feel free to comment below to tell me your thoughts, give this video a thumbs up, and subscribe to my channel for more content of the like. I wish you all a wonderful day and hope to hear from you soon.